Good evening from New York. He greeted his Egyptian audience today by saying, "Assalamu alaikum," or "peace be upon you." He quoted from the Quran 4 times and called it, in fact, as do the Muslims, the Holy Quran. He defined Iraq as an unnecessary war without apologizing for that war, and he was interrupted by applause 30 times, one man shouting, "We love you." Our fifth story on the countdown. None of this might seem remarkable if this man were not President of the United States. This morning in Cairo, Egypt, President Obama fulfilling another campaign promise by giving a major speech to the Islamic world. The president, also diplomat and tourist today, with Secretary of State Clinton visiting a mosque that has been the center of Islamic worship in Egypt for 600 years. With his staff visiting the pyramids, declaring that his trip to a burger joint last Friday was great, but that this was better. Taking particular delight in one proportionately disparate hieroglyph inside a tomb, exclaiming, quote, "That looks like me, look at those ears." His tour guide explaining the history of the tomb of Kar, who was a priest, a scholar, and a judge. Rahm Emanuel, among those staff members, deciding to go ahead and ride the camel. Press Secretary Gibbs playing photographer. The president telling reporters he would not be joining his chief of staff for the camel ride so long as the photographers were still around. The lighthearted nature of all that came before and after, and in no way distracted from the president's major item on the day's agenda, addressing 1.5 million followers of Islam, not as antagonists, but as equals.
I've come here to Cairo to seek a new beginning between the United States and Muslims around the world, one based on mutual interest and mutual respect. And I consider it part of my responsibility as President of the United States to fight against negative stereotypes of Islam wherever they appear. But that same principle must apply to Muslim perceptions of America. Just as Muslims do not fit a crude stereotype, America is not the crude stereotype of a self-interested empire.
President Obama with a reminder of who America's enemies are not.
America is not and never will be at war with Islam. We will, however, relentlessly confront violent extremists who pose a grave threat to our security.
Reminding all who America's enemies are not, without losing sight of whose America's enemies still are.
Al-Qaeda killed nearly 3,000 people on that day. The victims were innocent men, women, and children from America and many other nations who had done nothing to harm anybody. And yet Al-Qaeda chose to ruthlessly murder these people, claimed credit for the attack, and even now states their determination to kill on a massive scale.
Some conflicts having been entered into unnecessarily, he said, and under false pretenses.
Unlike Afghanistan, Iraq was a war of choice that provoked strong differences in my country and around the world.
President Obama decrying the Holocaust, defending the rights of Jews to a nation in their homeland, but also defending the rights of the Palestinians in equal measure.
The situation for the Palestinian people is intolerable, and America will not turn our backs on the legitimate Palestinian aspiration for dignity, opportunity, and a state of their own.
And more applause from that audience when the president announced that the days of using 9/11 as an excuse to justify torture, those days were over.
We are taking concrete actions to change course. I have unequivocally prohibited the use of torture by the United States, and I have ordered the prison at Guantanamo Bay closed by early next year.
President Obama also drawing contrast with the previous administration when he said that his administration would not be imposing its brand of government on the rest of the world.
No system of government can or should be imposed by one nation by any other. That does not lessen my commitment, however, to governments that reflect the will of the people.
The self-described Christian son of a Muslim father making reference to the common thread, the golden rule that weaves through all faiths.
There's one rule that lies at the heart of every religion: that we do unto others as we would have them do unto us. This truth transcends nations and peoples. A belief that isn't new, that isn't black or white or brown, that isn't Christian or Muslim or Jew. It's a belief that pulsed in the cradle of civilization.
Time now to turn to our own Howard Fineman, senior Washington correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Howard, good evening.
Hi, Keith.
Well, the campaign promise was kept here, but how did this speech go in terms of the intended audiences, the two levels of them, the followers of Islam around the world, and then secondarily, the people in this country who wanted to see what this man was going to say to those people?
Well, from talking to experts here and to sources of mine among Muslims and Arabs here in the United States, I would say that the speech came across very, very well. As you pointed out, the president used the idiom of Islam repeatedly, talking about the Holy Quran, the cadence of his speech, the phrases that he used, peace be upon you, and so forth. These were all instantly recognizable as signs of respect. That's number one. Number two, as Richard Hawes of the Council of Foreign Relations, I think one of the brightest guys and most knowledgeable about the Arab world, told me a little while ago, Obama audaciously and successfully inserted himself into the ongoing public conversations of the Islamic world. Arguments about the limits of the use of force and violence to achieve political ends, the role of women, openness of societies, what the Palestinians should do regarding Israel. Obama was kind of like the friendly visitor, the man who sits down at the cafe and has the audacity and the tact and the cultural background to instantly take part in those conversations and to show respect. As Hawes says, the narrative in that world has often been one of humiliation by the West. Here was our American president showing respect. In this case, words did matter.
And making this as part of a continuum, the race speech in Philadelphia, the abortion speech at Notre Dame, does this Cairo speech qualify as another example of how this president, instead of shying away from a difficult topic, not only breasts the storm, but also tries to step outside the limitations of the problem and to use the topic as a jumping-off point?
I think it's very much like the Philadelphia speech in certain respects. He dives right into the heart of the most nettlesome controversies, the most emotional ones, the most historic ones, and tries, in part using his own life experience, to confront the realities of the debates we should be having but aren't always having. That's what he did in Philadelphia, and he did it very eloquently and very shrewdly, because he had some narrow political purposes to accomplish in Philadelphia as well, and he did those. Here, once again, he's being eloquent and personal, but also delivering some sharp political messages to the Israelis, to the Palestinians, to the Iranians, indeed to all the actors there, speaking both soothingly and directly. It was really brilliantly done.
And where does it, do we have any idea where this fits? I mean, we sometimes these speeches take a while to sink in, but others are recognizable fairly instantly as important events more than important speeches. Ich bin ein Berliner from Kennedy and Tear Down This Wall from Reagan, and even Carter and the Camp David peace accords, more an event than a speech. Is it possible that this comes in that list of foreign policy events, or is it just a speech, albeit a very good one?
Well, it's more than just a speech, but less than a hinge moment in history, I think, Keith. From talking to the people who really know the history of the region and know their history of diplomacy, this doesn't quite have the feeling of that hinge moment that, say, Ich bin ein Berliner